House of the Dead, the complete horror story. The night was thick with mist as a group of 6 friends made their way down a forgotten road, their headlights cutting through the darkness. They had been traveling for hours, searching for something to excite them. A local legend had caught their attention, whispers of an old, abandoned mansion hidden deep in the forest. Its eerie reputation was a perfect match for their restless spirits, craving thrills beyond the mundane. The mansion, known as the House of the Dead, had stood silent for decades. The last owner, a reclusive doctor named Albert Morrow, had vanished without a trace one stormy night. No one knew for certain what had happened inside, but rumors circulated, unspeakable experiments, ghostly sightings, and a place where time itself seemed to distort. For the group, it was the ultimate challenge. They reached the mansion just as the last of the sunlight faded into the horizon. The house loomed like a giant skeleton in the mist, its windows empty, eyes watching them approach. The walls, cracked and peeling, whispered of a time long past, and the cold air that greeted them felt unnatural. As they stepped over the threshold, the floor groaned underfoot, and the doors slammed shut behind them, locking with an ominous finality. The air was thick with dust, and cobwebs stretched across every corner. Yet, the house felt alive, as if it were waiting for them. The friends spread out, eager to explore. As they ventured deeper, the air grew colder, and strange sounds echoed through the halls, footsteps, whispers, a distant scream. The walls seemed to pulse, and shadows moved in the corners of their vision. "There's something wrong with this place," Sarah, the most sensitive of the group, said. Her voice trembled as she glanced over her shoulder. But before anyone could respond, they heard the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open. It led them to a staircase that spiraled downward into the dark unknown. Curiosity overpowered their fear, and they descended into the basement. The room was filled with old medical equipment, some of which looked oddly modern despite the mansion's decay. Strange symbols were etched into the walls, and a large, iron door stood at the far end of the room. The door creaked open, revealing a hidden laboratory. The floor was stained, and glass vials, half filled with strange liquids, were scattered across tables. A large, glass containment chamber in the center of the room seemed to pulse with an unsettling energy. Suddenly, a voice echoed through the chamber. "You should not have come here." It was cold, calculated. The friends froze, their blood running cold. A figure emerged from the shadows, a tall man with hollow eyes and a lab coat stained with dark, old blood. "I am Dr. Albert Morrow," the figure said, his voice barely a whisper, "and you are standing in the place where I conducted my experiments. My research, it was never meant to leave these walls, and now, neither will you." As the words sank in, the friends realized they were not alone. Shadows shifted in the corners, their forms twisting and distorting, unnatural creatures that seemed to be made of darkness itself. Horrified, they turned to flee, but the doors slammed shut behind them. The room began to warp and shift, as if reality itself was bending under Morrow's influence. Desperate to escape, the group scattered, but one by one, they were hunted. The creatures in the shadows were no mere figments of imagination, they were the twisted results of Morrow's experiments. Bodies once human, now reanimated and reshaped into monstrosities. Sarah was the first to fall. Her screams echoed through the house as the shadows closed in on her. Then Mark, then James, until only 2 remained, Lily and Tom. They made their way back to the front door, hoping to escape, but as they reached for the handle, a figure appeared before them, Dr. Morrow, his eyes glowing with an eerie light. "It's too late," Morrow said. "The house has claimed you, just as it claimed all the others before you." Lily and Tom felt the cold fingers of the mansion grip them, pulling them into the very walls of the house. The last thing they saw was the flickering of the mansion's windows as they were swallowed by the darkness. The House of the Dead still stands, waiting for the next curious souls who dare to uncover its secrets. And once you enter, there's no way out. The mansion claims all who step foot inside, and their souls are forever trapped in the endless night. House of the Dead, the return of the lost souls. Years passed since the horrific fate of Lily, Tom, and the others who dared to explore the House of the Dead. The mansion, though still abandoned to the outside world, had taken on a new life, one that no longer just whispered in the winds, but beckoned to those who would listen. It was on a crisp autumn evening when 4 new adventurers, Lucas, Emma, Craig and Alice came across the rumors of the infamous house. They were drawn not by thrill, but by an eerie fascination. Their research into local legends had uncovered chilling accounts of those who vanished near the mansion. Their names whispered among locals as warnings, but rather than being deterred, they were intrigued. Emma, the skeptic, believed the stories were mere superstition, while Lucas, her brother, hoped to document the haunting, as he had for years. Craig, the quiet one, had always been fascinated by the supernatural, and Alice, she was simply curious. After weeks of planning, they arrived at the mansion just as dusk settled over the forest. The house greeted them much as it had the others before, dark and imposing, with its tall spires reaching into the sky. The air around it felt thick, almost oppressive. Unlike the others, they noticed something different. The house seemed more alive, the air inside heavier with the scent of decay, but also something else, something ancient, as though time itself was being twisted within its walls. Without hesitation, they stepped inside, the doors creaking closed behind them. The house did not welcome them, but it did not immediately attack. Instead, it allowed them to explore, to move deeper into the heart of its decaying structure, almost as if it were studying them, waiting. But as night fell completely, they found themselves in the same basement where Lily and Tom had met their end. The very air seemed to hum with a dark energy. Craig, who had been trailing behind the group, suddenly froze. "I think we're not alone," he muttered. Emma scoffed, brushing it off. "It's just your mind playing tricks on you." But Lucas, holding a camera to record everything, had caught a glimpse of something moving in the corner of the room. He squinted, his pulse quickening. "I saw something," he whispered, his voice tight with unease. Before they could react, the air around them grew cold, impossibly cold. A faint whisper filled the room, a voice distorted by time, warping and cracking. It spoke with a hollow echo, familiar yet distant. "You shouldn't have come." The temperature dropped further. Alice, shaking, grabbed onto Emma, her face pale. "What is that?" she gasped. The shadows in the corners of the room stirred, and what emerged from the darkness were not the twisted experiments of Dr. Morrow, but the figures of the long-dead adventurers, Lily, Tom, Sarah, Mark, and James. They were no longer fully human. Their forms had decayed into something far more sinister. Eyes empty, their flesh was mottled and rotting, their limbs bent unnaturally. But despite their grotesque appearance, there was something unmistakably human in their expressions, the desperation, the terror. "Help us," Lily's voice crackled from a rotted mouth. "We're trapped. You will be too." Emma screamed as the apparitions reached out toward them. The group stumbled backward, but the door slammed shut before they could escape. The house had changed. It was no longer a building, it was a living, breathing entity. The floor beneath them cracked open, revealing a dark abyss. From the depths, a figure emerged. Dr. Albert Morrow, though now more skeletal than before, still clung to his twisted humanity. His eyes burned with the same sickly, unnatural glow. "You've awakened it," Morrow rasped, his voice full of malice. "The house feeds on souls, and now, it wants you." As he spoke, the walls shifted, the house contorting and growing, as if it were alive, seeking to claim them. The floor beneath their feet trembled, and the basement filled with the howls of the lost souls who had once been part of Morrow's twisted experiments. Craig, in a panic, ran toward the door, but it wouldn't open. His eyes locked with the horror-stricken faces of the other victims, and in his heart, he knew there was no escape. One by one, the souls of those who had come before them reached out, their hands cold and clawing, pulling them toward the blackened void at the center of the room. "Run!" Alice screamed. But there was no place to run. The house of the dead fed on their fear, their desperation, and with every agonizing moment, their spirits were pulled into the void, becoming part of the house's eternal hunger. The mansion absorbed them, trapping their souls in the labyrinth of shifting walls and endless corridors. And so, the house had claimed them all, just as it had claimed Lily, Tom, and the others before them. The mansion stood silent once more, but the whispers of the dead lingered in the air, a warning to those who would dare to seek out its cursed secrets. The house of the dead waits, endlessly hungry, and its walls are always ready to consume anyone foolish enough to enter. For once you step inside, you are not just a visitor, you become a part of the house. A lost soul forever wandering its endless corridors. House of the Dead, The Awakening. The House of the Dead had devoured many over the years, its walls forever echoing with the whispers of those it had trapped. Each soul that entered became a part of the mansion, but there were those whose presence had disturbed the house in ways it had not experienced before. As the years passed, the house grew hungrier, more powerful, and it wasn't just a place of death anymore, but a place where the veil between the living and the dead was thinning. One stormy night, four strangers, drawn to the house by a shared, inexplicable force, arrived at the gates of the mansion. They were not there by mere curiosity, but by something darker, a need to uncover the truth that had remained buried for decades. Lena, a paranormal investigator, had spent years researching the house and its dark past. She was convinced there was more to the mansion than just ghosts. She believed the house itself had a consciousness, one that was feeding off the souls trapped within. Her research had led her to the mansion's cursed history, and tonight, she was determined to uncover the secrets hidden within its walls. Alongside her was Sam, a medium who had recently come into contact with a strange energy that seemed to pulse from the house. He had experienced vivid visions of the mansion's horrors, and now, he had come to confront whatever was calling him. The third was Greg, a skeptical ex-cop turned journalist, who thought the whole thing was a hoax but felt an unshakable sense of dread. And lastly, there was Jenna, a young woman who had lost her brother years ago in the house. She had never accepted his disappearance and had returned to find closure, or revenge. As the group approached the mansion, the wind howled like a warning. The house stood ominously in front of them, its jagged silhouette cutting through the stormy night sky. They could feel its pull, like an invisible force urging them to enter, to discover the darkness within. They crossed the threshold, and immediately, the temperature dropped. The walls groaned, as if welcoming them. The door slammed behind them with a deafening crack, and the house seemed to settle into an unsettling stillness. Lena turned to Sam. "Do you feel it? The energy? It's different, stronger." Sam nodded, his eyes wide with realization. "It's awake. Something is waking inside." They began their journey deeper into the mansion, navigating the halls with only the flickering light of their flashlights to guide them. The house seemed endless, stretching on in every direction, with no clear way out. The silence around them was thick, almost suffocating, and the distant sound of whispers reached their ears. At first, it was faint, just a murmur of voices, but as they moved, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. Lena stopped in her tracks, her eyes widening as she saw a figure standing at the far end of the hallway. It was a man, thin and pale, with hollow eyes. He was dressed in old-fashioned clothes, but something about him felt wrong. He was not quite human, not quite ghost. The figure turned toward them, its face blank and emotionless. "Leave now," it whispered, its voice an echo of despair. "Who are you?" Sam asked, his voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it gestured to the walls around them, and the house seemed to shift, the air growing heavier. The temperature dropped even further, and the whispers became louder, more frantic. "The house feeds," the figure said, its voice fading as if it was being swallowed by the very walls themselves. Lena's heart raced. "We need to find the source, the heart of this house. We have to end this." But as they turned to leave, the walls began to tremble. Suddenly, the ground beneath them cracked open, and they were plunged into darkness. When they awoke, they were in the basement, surrounded by the remnants of the twisted experiments Dr. Morrow had once conducted. The floor was littered with decaying remains, the stench of death overwhelming. And then they saw it. At the center of the room stood a massive, pulsating stone, an altar of sorts, its surface covered in dark runes and strange symbols. The stone was alive, thrumming with an unnatural energy, and around it were the spirits of the long-lost souls, their forms twisted and broken, writhing in agony. Jenna gasped. "That's where he did it, the doctor's experiments. The stone is the source." The spirits began to howl, their faces contorted in pain as they reached toward the group, their skeletal hands clawing at the air. From the shadows, a figure emerged, the twisted form of Dr. Albert Morrow. His body was an unnatural amalgamation of flesh and bone, his skin stretched too thin, his face a mask of madness. "You should not have come here," he growled, his voice low and threatening. "The house, it is not just a place, but a vessel for me." With a snap of his fingers, the spirits surged forward, their hands reaching for the group. Sam raised his hand, trying to use his powers to hold them back, but it was too much. The energy from the stone was too strong. Lena's eyes locked onto the stone. She realized that Morrow had used the house to create something far worse than any of his twisted experiments. The house wasn't just trapping souls, it was feeding on them, using them to awaken a darker, more ancient force, something that could not be stopped by any human means. "We have to destroy it," Lena shouted, rushing toward the altar. But Morrow was faster. With a wave of his hand, the stone split, and the air around them was filled with a blinding light. As the light faded, the stone had cracked open, revealing something much darker beneath, a black, swirling abyss that seemed to reach out, pulling the very essence of reality into it. The walls of the house began to buckle and collapse as the ground split open. The house itself was dying, and with it, the souls trapped within. Lena, Sam, Jenna, and Greg realized with terror that they weren't just fighting to escape anymore. They were fighting for the very survival of the world. With one last desperate push, Lena reached the altar and grabbed the stone. Feeling the darkness trying to consume her, with all the strength she could muster, she hurled the stone into the abyss. A deafening roar filled the air as the house trembled. The walls cracked and crumbled, the floor split apart, and the house itself began to collapse into the black void beneath it. The spirits, once trapped, screamed as they were freed. The house, the vessel for Morrow's twisted experiments, began to collapse in on itself, and the remaining souls were finally released into the afterlife. The group stumbled through the crumbling halls, barely escaping as the mansion fell into the darkness below. As they emerged from the ruins, they looked back, and the house had vanished entirely, consumed by the void it had been feeding. The house of the dead was no more, but the scars it had left on the world were deep, and the memories of those who had vanished inside it would never be forgotten. For some, it was the end of a nightmare, but for others, the darkness had only just begun. House of the Dead, the Eternal Curse. Though the mansion that had once been known as the House of the Dead had collapsed into the abyss, its dark influence lingered. The evil that had spawned within its decaying walls had not been fully eradicated, and it was not content to simply fade into history. Months passed since Lena, Sam, Jenna, and Greg had escaped. The world around them began to return to normal, but none of them could forget the horrors they had witnessed, the lives lost, and the souls they had failed to save. Each of them carried the weight of the house's curse, a curse that had etched itself into their very beings, and its darkness continued to creep into their lives. Jenna, still grieving the loss of her brother and the friends they'd lost to the mansion, found herself waking up in the dead of night, the whispers of the house following her every step. She saw fleeting shadows at the edges of her vision, heard faint, distant screams that seemed to come from nowhere. The walls of her home felt too close, the air too thick, as if something was always watching her. Sam, having once been the skeptic, now struggled with the abilities he'd gained after encountering the dark energy within the mansion. His psychic powers, once subtle, had grown stronger. He could see spirits, hear their cries for help, and feel their pain. But it wasn't just the dead calling to him, it was something more sinister. He began to see the dark figure of Dr. Morrow, his hollow eyes ever present, watching from the shadows. Greg, forever scarred by the horrors he had witnessed, turned to alcohol, trying to bury the memories of the mansion. But no amount of drink could dull the fear that churned inside him. His nights were plagued by nightmares, his subconscious haunted by visions of the crumbling house and the faceless souls that had reached for him in those final moments. Lena, the leader, had tried to put the house behind her. She had published her findings, spoken to the media about the haunting, and even worked to warn others about the dangers of the mansion's dark history. But the truth haunted her. What if it wasn't over? What if they hadn't truly destroyed the evil that had taken root in the mansion? What if the curse had merely taken a different form, one that had followed them into the world? And then, one fateful night, their worst fears came true. It was Lena who received the first message, a phone call in the dead of night. The voice on the other end was muffled and distorted, but there was no mistaking it. "You can't escape it," the voice hissed. "You never really destroyed it. It's coming back." Sam felt it at the same time. A coldness crept over him, a surge of dark energy that twisted his senses. The world around him seemed to crack and distort, the shadows growing longer, darker. It was the house, or what remained of it. The curse had found them again. Greg's phone rang next, and he too heard the same chilling words. You thought you could escape? The house. It's coming for you. And finally, Jenna. She sat alone in her room when the darkness filled it, swirling around her, making her skin crawl. The walls seemed to close in, and as she looked in the mirror, she saw something terrible, a reflection of herself, but with hollow, dead eyes, staring back at her. The house, or whatever force had spawned from it, had been dormant for too long. It was hungry again. The group reunited once more, drawn together by the same force, the same nightmare that haunted them. They gathered in Lena's apartment, where the air was thick with dread. They knew what was coming. We need to finish this, Lena said, her voice steady but filled with fear. We didn't destroy the house, we only weakened it. It's not just the house, Sam replied, his eyes wide with realization. It's the entity that was inside. It's still alive. It's using the house, using the memories, using everything it touched. It has spread. Jenna clenched her fists. We have to stop it before it destroys everything. But how could they fight something that was no longer confined to the mansion? They had broken the physical shell of the house, but the malevolent force within it had only grown stronger. It no longer needed the house, it was a parasite, feeding off their fear, their guilt, their pain. It was everywhere now, waiting for the right moment to strike. The friends did the only thing they could think of. They returned to the site where the house had once stood, where the darkness had bled into the world. But as they approached the ruins, the ground trembled beneath their feet. The earth seemed to pulse, as if the world itself was alive with malevolent energy. It was then that they realized, the house hadn't just been destroyed, it had become something worse. The mansion had been a gateway, a portal to a much darker force, and that force had slipped through. The mansion wasn't just a house anymore, it was a prison. The very earth was now tainted, a living, breathing prison for the curse. A deep, resonating voice filled their minds, an ancient voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. You cannot stop what you have unleashed. It boomed. You were always meant to fail. You are the vessels. You are the ones who will bring the end. The ground cracked open before them, and the sky above twisted into a dark, swirling vortex. Shadows began to rise from the earth, taking shape as figures, horrible, contorted, and monstrous. The souls of the dead were rising once again, not as lost spirits, but as weapons in the hands of the ancient force that had once inhabited the house. Lena, Sam, Jenna, and Greg stood their ground, knowing they had no choice. They had to face it, once and for all. The curse would not stop until it had consumed everything, and they were the last hope. With a unified cry, they reached out with everything they had left, Lena using her knowledge of the house's rituals, Sam focusing his psychic powers, Jenna drawing on her brother's memory, and Greg tapping into the strength he had buried deep within. Together, they cast everything they had into the heart of the vortex, trying to seal it away. But the force fought back, a raging storm of darkness that threatened to swallow them whole. Just as it seemed all hope was lost, a figure emerged from the vortex, a figure made of light, pure and brilliant. It was the spirit of Dr. Morrow's first victim, the one who had tried to stop him long ago. In that moment, the figure turned toward the darkness and spoke words in an ancient tongue, sealing the vortex and banishing the curse from the world. The darkness screamed one last time as it was consumed by light. The ground fell silent. The vortex vanished. The shadows disappeared. The house, the curse, and the horrors it had spawned were gone. But as the group looked around, they knew it wasn't over. Evil never truly vanishes, it lingers, it waits, and it learns. The fight against the darkness was far from finished. The house of the dead may have been destroyed, but the eternal curse of the mansion would always be with them, lurking in the corners of their minds, waiting for the day it would rise again. And when it did, they would be ready. House of the Dead, the reawakening. Years passed since the last battle, and life had slowly returned to something resembling normalcy for Lena, Sam, Jenna, and Greg. The darkness that had once threatened to consume the world had been sealed away, and the curse of the mansion, the House of the Dead, had been silenced. They thought they had put an end to it, that they had vanquished the evil that had stalked them for so long. But the darkness had never truly been destroyed. It had only been held at bay, waiting for the right moment to rise again. In the quiet after the storm, each of them tried to move on. Jenna had rebuilt her life, finding solace in the memory of her brother. But the nightmares never fully ceased. Sam's psychic abilities had become dormant again, though sometimes, when the wind was right, he felt a cold shiver down his spine. Greg tried to put the horrors behind him, but he was haunted by a lingering sense of dread that refused to fade. Lena, the one who had led them all, knew better than to think it was truly over. She had dedicated her life to uncovering the truth, and in her heart, she knew there was always more to discover. And then, the unthinkable happened. It began with a strange series of disappearances. People in a small town near the old mansion started to vanish, one by one. At first, it seemed like an isolated issue, but as the weeks passed, the disappearances grew in frequency. The local authorities were baffled, unable to explain the eerie pattern. Some whispered that it was the work of a serial killer, while others feared something darker was at play. One night, Lena received a message. It was an old, familiar voice. "Lena," the voice croaked. It was Sam. "You need to come back. The house, it's alive again." Her heart sank. She immediately called Jenna, Greg, and Sam, and the four of them reunited, this time more weary than ever. The mansion that had once been thought destroyed was now sending out tendrils of darkness again. Something had stirred it from its grave. They returned to the town where it all began, their fears confirmed as they approached the old, decaying site. The ruins of the House of the Dead were gone, replaced by a thick, unwelcoming fog that hung over the land. But as they drew closer, the air grew colder, and the earth beneath their feet began to tremble. The ground was shifting, changing. The mansion was not gone, it had risen from the depths, rebuilt in a twisted mockery of what it once was. The house was alive, its walls pulsing with an unnatural energy. The very land surrounding it had become corrupted, as if the mansion was feeding on the earth itself. A dark cloud hovered above it, casting the entire area in a perpetual shadow. Lena's heart pounded in her chest. "It's not just a house," she said, her voice shaking. "It's something worse. It's alive. It was never really destroyed. It found a way to come back." As they stepped inside, the doors slammed shut behind them once more. The air was thick with the smell of decay and rot. The walls were slick with something that felt wrong, unnatural. The mansion was different, more grotesque than before. It had absorbed the land around it, twisting it into a distorted reflection of itself. The architecture was now nightmarish, flickering lights, elongated corridors, walls that seemed to bend and warp with every step they took. But it wasn't just the house that had changed. The souls trapped within its walls, those who had once been twisted by Morrow's experiments, were now more than just apparitions. They were creatures of the dark, their forms more monstrous and grotesque than ever before. The spirits of the lost began to emerge from the shadows, their eyes hollow, their bodies contorted in unnatural ways. Some were grotesque versions of themselves, their once human features twisted beyond recognition. Others were something else entirely, creatures formed of shadow and smoke, their mouths opening to release a low, guttural growl. These were not mere ghosts. They were hunters, born of the house's malevolent will. The group pressed forward, realizing that this was no longer just about surviving the house. It was about preventing an even darker force from breaking free. "Do you hear it?" Sam asked, his voice quiet. His eyes were wide with fear. "It's calling to us, the darkness, the one who controls the house. We need to find the heart of it, before it finds us." They followed the pulsing energy deep into the bowels of the mansion. As they descended into the basement, the temperature plummeted. The stone walls seemed to close in on them, the very air growing thick and suffocating. The house seemed to mock their every step, shifting and warping around them, as though it was alive and aware of their presence. Then, they saw it. At the heart of the mansion, in a vast underground chamber, stood a massive stone altar, larger than any of them could have imagined. The stone was cracked and blackened, pulsing with dark energy. Above it hung a swirling, dark vortex, a tear in the fabric of reality itself. The air around them vibrated with the power of the entity that resided within the house. They could feel its presence, its hunger. The curse that had once been confined to the mansion was no longer just a force of evil, it was a living, breathing entity, a being that existed beyond the house itself. It was the heart of the house, and it was awakening once more. Lena stepped forward, determination in her eyes. "We have to destroy it. We can't let it spread." But as she moved closer, the shadows stirred, and from the vortex, a figure emerged. Dr. Albert Morrow. His form was different this time. He was no longer just a man, but something twisted, monstrous. His body was fused with the dark energy that had been summoned by the house. His eyes burned with the same cold, empty glow they had all seen before. You should have never returned. Morrow's voice boomed. The house is mine now, and with it, I will bring an end to your world. You can't destroy me. You can never destroy what is already inside you. The walls trembled as Morrow raised his arms, and the vortex above the altar grew wider, its power threatening to tear the very fabric of reality apart. With a final, desperate push, Lena, Sam, Jenna, and Greg combined their powers, everything they had left, to fight back. They used every ounce of strength to push against the darkness, pulling from the memories of those who had been lost, from the courage they had summoned in their past battles. The battle between light and darkness raged in the chamber, the very foundation of the house shaking as the curse fought to reclaim everything it had lost. And in the heart of that battle, the mansion, the living house, began to collapse once more. But this time, it was different. The house was not simply falling, it was being torn apart, piece by piece, and as the darkness reached its peak, the energy within the vortex was consumed by the collective power of the four. With a final, blinding burst of light, the curse was shattered, the house collapsing into nothingness, leaving only silence in its wake. The house of the dead was finally gone, forever. But as the group stood in the ruins, they knew one truth, that evil never truly disappears. It only waits, watching, learning, and waiting for its next chance to strike. And should it ever rise again, they would be ready. For the house of the dead was no longer just a place, it was a curse, an eternal presence that would haunt the living forever. House of the Dead, the eternal return. The darkness of the House of the Dead had been defeated, or so they thought, after the final confrontation. When the mansion crumbled into nothingness and the curse was shattered, Lena, Sam, Jenna, and Greg returned to their lives, carrying with them the weight of what they'd endured. They believed that their final battle had ended the nightmare, that they had closed the door on a terror that had haunted them for so long. But in the deep corners of the universe, where time and space twisted in unnatural ways, evil had never truly been destroyed, it had merely taken another form. The curse of the House of the Dead was not confined to one place, it was a force that transcended reality, existing beyond the mansion's walls. It was an ancient, insidious evil that could never be fully vanquished. It had taken on the shape of a house, a place, a memory, because it needed a vessel. Now, with the vessel destroyed, the force had nowhere to go but within. It had taken root in the hearts of the survivors. And so, the curse began to grow again, but this time, it was more subtle, more insidious. Lena was the first to feel it. At first, it was small things, shadows in the corner of her vision, a fleeting sense of déjà vu. Then, the whispers started. They were soft at first, like a distant hum, but they grew louder, clawing at her mind. She could hear them wherever she went, calling her name, urging her to return to the house, to finish what she had started. Sam began experiencing the same sensation. His psychic powers, which had been dormant, surged back to life, but they came with a terrible cost. He could see the spirits again, but now, they were different. They were more twisted, more grotesque. They spoke to him, their voices dripping with malice. The nightmares returned, and with them, the vision of Dr. Morrow, his hollow eyes, his voice filled with eternal hunger. Greg, ever the skeptic, tried to push the memories away, but the curse had already worked its way into his soul. He began hearing the whispers too, not from the shadows, but from within. It was like a voice buried deep inside him, a voice that wanted him to take one final step into the darkness. He could feel the darkness gnawing at him, pulling him toward the unknown. Jenna, having finally found peace with the memory of her brother, began to see signs of him again, his face in mirrors, his laughter echoing through empty rooms. But these weren't the comforting memories she had once cherished. They were distorted, filled with pain and rage. Her brother's spirit was calling to her, not for closure, but for something far darker. The curse had not been defeated. It had been reborn, wrapped around their hearts and minds, and it was pulling them back toward the very place they had tried so hard to escape. It was only when they began to come together again that they realized the truth. They were not the only ones affected. The town that had once been haunted by the mansion was beginning to experience the same horrors. The people were changing. They had become shadows of their former selves, lost in madness, driven by a force they couldn't understand. The town itself seemed to be rotting from the inside out, as if the darkness was slowly swallowing it whole. Lena, Sam, Jenna, and Greg knew they had to face the reality that they hadn't finished the fight. The House of the Dead was not merely a place, it was an entity that had found a new way to exist. The curse had not been eradicated, it had only evolved. They returned to the ruins, hoping to find answers, but what they found was far worse than they had imagined. The land around the site was barren, the trees twisted and gnarled, their branches clawing at the sky. The fog that had once surrounded the mansion was back, thicker than ever, choking the air. As they approached the foundation of the house, they saw it, a symbol, carved deep into the ground, glowing with an eerie, otherworldly light. The symbol was familiar, a design they had seen before, etched into the stone altar where the final battle had taken place. The house was returning, but it wasn't rebuilding in the same way. It was no longer bound to a physical form. It was becoming something much more dangerous, a force that could bend reality itself. And then they saw him again. Dr. Morrow's figure emerged from the mist, but this time, he wasn't alone. Behind him stood the twisted forms of the souls that had once been trapped within the house. They were no longer mere spirits, they were part of the curse itself, bound to Morrow, to the entity that had taken over the land. "Did you really think you could destroy me?" Morrow's voice echoed, distorted by the shifting reality around them. "You cannot kill what is eternal. The house is not just wood and stone. It is a reflection of the darkness that lies within all of us. You will never escape it. It will follow you, haunt you, twist you until you are nothing but shadows of your former selves." The ground trembled as the very earth seemed to warp around them. The air crackled with dark energy, and the skies above began to bleed a sickly, unnatural color. It was as if the world itself was unraveling. Lena stepped forward, eyes blazing with defiance. "We've been through this before. We can end this. We will end this." But Morrow only laughed, the sound echoing like 1,000 dying screams. "You think you have a choice? The house is no longer a place. It is a force of nature, and it lives in you. The curse has always been inside of you, inside your hearts. It will never let you go." The battle had changed. It was no longer about destroying the house. It was about confronting the darkness within themselves. The curse had never been just a mansion. It was an idea, a force that had infected them, and it would follow them wherever they went. Sam clenched his fists, the psychic energy surging within him. He had always thought the house was a physical entity, a place to be destroyed. But now, he understood, it was much more insidious. He focused his mind, trying to reach deep within himself, trying to sever the dark connection that had been tied to him from the moment he had first entered the mansion. Jenna closed her eyes, holding on to the memory of her brother, not the twisted version the house had created, but the boy she had loved. She called out to his spirit, hoping to break the curse's hold on her heart, to remind herself of the person she once was. Greg, struggling with the shadows inside himself, knew he had to fight the darkness within him. He had always been afraid of what lay inside, but now he understood it was not fear that could defeat it. It was courage. He stepped forward, determined to face the evil that had followed him for so long. Lena, the leader, stood at the center, knowing that this final battle would determine everything. She reached deep into her knowledge, drawing from every ritual, every ancient text she had ever studied. She began to chant, words of power that she hoped would sever the connection between the curse and the world. Together, they focused their energy, their collective will, pushing against the dark force that had been entwined with their souls. It was a battle not just for survival, but for their very identities. And then, in a blinding flash of light, the world seemed to explode in a wave of pure energy. The curse was broken, or so they thought. But as they looked around, they knew that darkness would never truly vanish. It would always return, reborn and reshaped. The house might be gone, but the evil it had birthed would never be extinguished. Because the House of the Dead was not just a place. It was an idea, a curse, a force that would never be fully destroyed. And in the end, they realized one grim truth: the battle would never truly be over.